Dear ladies and gentlemen, we are starting our high-level session. Let me invite the speakers first. Bakhyt Sultanov, Massimiliano Castelli, Ayhan Kose, Masood Ahmed, and Marc Uzan. Dear Marc, the floor is yours for the beginning.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the opening of the Astana Economic Forum. My name is Marc. I am the founder of the Reinventing Bretton, and I have been involved with the forum over the last 5 years. We are very privileged today to have a very high-level group of speakers who will be looking at the major uncertainties that the global economy is facing. The title of our forum and our sessions over the next 2 days has been called The End of Hyper-Globalization. And in fact, we should have put a question mark. When we were talking about the end of hyper-globalization, we were referring to the issue of trade. And we see recently that trade is growing more slowly than the global economy. That was not the case since the 1980s. Trade, on average, was growing twice as fast as the global economy. At the very least, the end of hyper-globalization of the past 2 decades may be upon us. Can we assure that the globalization is irreversible? Maybe not, but we have a lot of threats in the global economy. We are afraid of high unemployment, afraid of low growth, afraid of rising inequality, and we need to figure out how we are going to deal with this rising threat. We are not able to achieve over the last 7 years a strong, fair, and sustainable growth since the 2007 financial crisis, and that's been the goal of the G20. So I think what we need to do is how we are going to struggle with boom and busts, and we hope that this conference will be able to try to achieve a sense of consensus as we are seeing a major backlash against fair openness to trade, openness to investments, and now openness to financial integrations. We are going to have a very good of speakers over the last 2 days, and we started and we felt it was very important to start with a major driver, commodity prices. And oil here in Kazakhstan is very important to try to understand what is going to be the prospect of oil prices, of commodities, but also what will be the best way to move away and to be able to diversify the economy. Before I give the floor to Massimiliano Castelli, who will be share the session on oil, I just want to give you and to remind you about a publication where you can find the background papers of this conference, The End of Hyper-Globalization. And I will take this opportunity to thank KPMG, who has been a strong supporter of this initiative and this conference and the publications. Last but not least, I think the issue that we'll be discussing, that we'll be sharing after this session will be about the common forces of the global economy, monetary policy. Can we move beyond monetary policy? How we are going to deal with spillovers? So we have a major agenda for the next few days. Thank you again for joining, and let me now give the floor to Massimiliano Castelli. Massimiliano Castelli is the Managing Director of UBS Asset Management, and he will share the first panel. Massimiliano, please.
Thank you very much, Marc. It's a pleasure to be here. I believe it is my 4th year in a row that I participate in the Astana Economic Forum, and it's always a pleasure to come back. I think we have a very interesting session. Let me remind you the title, Global and Regional Context, the End of the Super Cycle of Commodity Price. Let me just do some introductory remarks, and then I will immediately pass the ball to our 3 speakers. And I always been very skeptical about the concept of a super cycle theory, because I always believe that this type of forecasts, which are in some way extrapolated and put into the future forever, they always tend to be, in the end, not true. And, but I believe it, and this is the case of oil price over the last, say, 1.5 years. Probably came a little bit earlier than we expected, and actually came on the back of a worsening in the global economic outlook that started in the summer with the problem surrounding China. And actually we entered in 2016 where talks about oil price at $20 were pretty common. Now let me just say that we are back at around just below, shy of $50 a barrel, which of course is not the $100 that we have been using for a very long time, but for sure it is very different, and it feels different from the $20 that we were fearing just a few months back. So this is the first topic of the panel, to discuss a little bit about what is the outlook for oil price, also on the back of what's going on in the industry on the supply side, particularly in the US. The second question is that the drop in oil price has dramatically changed the outlook for a large block of emerging market economies where the main source of revenues is from oil exports. And this has actually had not only an impact on them, but also it has an impact on how the policy mix of this country has evolved over the last few months. And so I think this is the second topic of the panel, to discuss about how these countries are currently coping with the new environment in the energy market, in particular with soaring fiscal deficit and lower current account surplus, or even negative current account surplus in some cases. I think there is also a third topic, which is of great interest, in particular for people like me. We work in the financial service industry, so we tend to see the capital side of the oil market story, which has been the dramatic rise in assets managed by either central banks or sovereign wealth funds, where they have been used to receiving a large amount of funding from oil exports. The change outlook in the energy price has also changed the outlook for this institution in terms of, first of all, how they manage their assets, but second, and probably most important, is that they've been called in several cases by their respective governments to provide additional funding to fill the fiscal gap which opened up as oil price came down. So without further ado, I would like to start immediately with our first speakers, who is Ayhan Kose, Director, Development Prospect of the Group of the World Bank, who I think will start by giving us an overview about the state of the global economy and the implication for the oil price. Please, the floor is yours, Ayhan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here in Astana. I greatly appreciate the organizers for inviting me. So I have this job of putting these issues in context, and I thought that it would be good if I talk about global economy, myths, hopes, and realities. So I will ask three quick questions. The first one, what's happening to global growth? I think that story is very clear. Growth prospects are weak, and these weak growth prospects are quite persistent. The second one, what's the status of commodity markets? There is this issue of supply there. We have ample supply, and you see in a number of commodities, there is this strive for stability. And then the third question is also related to commodity market dynamics, and it's in the back of many market participants and policymakers. Is a global recession underway, given that we have this very weak global environment? The answer is that no, it's not underway right now, but risks are rising with significant implications for oil markets. It's not about the supply, that's about the demand. So let me talk about the big picture with respect to global economy. There's a lot of chatter. I would call all the chatter myths mostly. There's quite a bit of hope, mostly on the part of policymakers, and there is a reality, hopefully I can convince you about. With respect to global growth, the myth, especially early in the year, we heard around, is that the global growth is so weak, actually there is a global recession underway. On the part of policymakers, the hope was that the growth will accelerate. As always, the reality is that there is no ongoing global recession, but the growth is quite weak and the risks are getting larger. The second area, we have this kind of myths and hopes and realities basically fighting with each other. It's about cyclical policies. The myth there is no policy space, especially in the context of monetary policy in advanced economies, and in some cases fiscal policy as well. And there is no, these policies are no longer effective. This extraordinary use of unconventional monetary policies, they haven't been delivering the type of, the inflation or growth expected, and they are not effective, the types of conventional policies we have seen. Again, on the part of course, policymakers, their hope is that current policies will ultimately deliver what they hope. The reality is that there is some space. That space is available, but it's quite small in the case of monetary policy as well as fiscal policy. And the use of these policies have unintended consequences. Now, the third important area, the structural policies we basically constantly recommend, both IMF and the World Bank, to countries around the world. The myth is that these policies produce only long-term gains. On the part of policymakers, unfortunately, hope that it is an option to delay the implementation of structural policies. The reality is that there are immediate gains associated with these types of policies, especially in countries, emerging markets, frontier markets like Kazakhstan, and these immediate gains are associated with the signaling value of these policies. The ability for governments to signal that they care about medium-term growth prospects and undertake policies accordingly. Now, let me turn to the global economy. What's going on there? There's this muddling through process that has been underway since 2010. Last year was really unfortunate. We saw the global economy registering the lowest growth since the crisis. In the case of advanced and emerging market economies, growth has been disappointing as well. In advanced economies, growth this year is going to be around 1.7%, emerging markets around 3.5%. We are going to release our Global Economic Prospects report, and we are going to downgrade our forecast relative to what we had in January. Now, especially in the context of emerging markets and frontier markets, there has been a significant slowdown underway since 2010. And this graph clearly shows you the extent of that slowdown. In 2010, growth was just below 8%. You come to 2016, growth is around, less than 4%. This is not about China. If you take out China, you see that growth is slowing very sharply. And it's true for frontier markets as well. Growth has been dismal. And in 2016, things are not going to be that different. Growth forecasts are going to be downgraded, as I mentioned. What is important in this figure to see is that growth is not just weak, it's weaker than it is long-term average in the case of emerging markets as well as frontier market economies. Now, let me turn to the second question I asked, the status of commodity markets. 2015 was a dramatic year for commodity markets because more than 90% of commodities saw that prices went down from 2014 to 15. The World Bank follows 46 commodities. Out of these 46 commodities, more than 90% of them saw prices going down from 14 to 15. This was the first time it happened since 1980. Now, recently, we saw some pickup, at least in the case of oil markets, and this pickup mostly related to what happened in the United States as the production started going down, growth rate of production. And there is some hope later in the year, whatever the excess supply the market has, the difference between production and consumption is going to disappear and going to provide upward pressure on the price. You have been seeing that upward pressure recently as developments in Nigeria, Canada, suggesting a decline in supply. But there is still ample inventories, and those inventories, of course, going to create pressure on the price. So the big story about oil is on the supply side, and in all likelihood, that's going to drive the oil price dynamics going forward. One thing we need to remember is that as much as prices have declined quite a bit since 2011, in all commodity markets, and in the case of oil since 2014, prices are still above the levels we have seen in 2000. So, if global economy receives another adverse shock, and we see dynamics on the demand side weakening, we might see more weakness in commodity markets. Now, let me turn to the third question I ask. Is a global recession underway? This is an important question for commodity markets because it is directly about the demand side of the markets. As I mentioned, we have a pretty good idea about the supply side, but the demand side is going to become increasingly more important as global growth remains weak. So now, what is a global recession? In a typical global recession, per capita global output contracts. Along with, what you see in a typical economy, industrial production contracts, global trade contracts, global capital flow contracts, employment goes down, and of course, energy consumption declines. There were only 4 episodes since 1960, which we call global recessions. In 1975, 82, 91, and 2009. Global growth, as I mentioned, reached its lowest level since 2015. And early in the year, there was quite a bit of market volatility. Because of that, we heard quite a bit of chatter whether there is a global recession underway or not. Now, when you look at these episodes, the 75, 82, 91, and 2009, as I mentioned, per capita output declines, industrial production declines, trade collapses, and unemployment rate increases. In 2016, and going forward, our forecasts suggest this year or the next year, these years do not qualify as global recessions. We expect the global economy actually to produce growth numbers. These numbers are going to be low, but nowhere near the global recession type growth numbers. The per capita is contracting, or industrial production collapsing, or the trade, even as much as it is quite weak, collapsing. Now, what happens during global recessions is that oil price declines, along with what? The oil consumption. In each global recession episode, actual oil consumption declined at the global level. But in 2016, so far, as well as in 2015, global oil consumption has been rather healthy, even though global growth has been weak. Now, what's the big problem then if we are not having a global recession? The problem is that the recovery is quite weak. When you look at the global expansions following each global recession, the 75, 82, 91, and 2009, for advanced economies, this global expansion has been the weakest one. In terms of investment, as well, it has been the weakest one. Emerging markets did extremely well right after the 2009 global recession, but as I mentioned, growth has been weakening in those economies as well. And investment now actually has been the weakest recovery in emerging market economies has been experiencing when you compare with these 4 global recessions. So the risks are rising, and in a sense, global economy is one shock away to have a major slowdown. So I asked 3 questions to put the discussion in context. The first one, the state of the global growth. The weak growth persists. In all likelihood, we will see a weaker growth this year than last year. In terms of commodity markets, there is ample supply, but there is this strive for stability, and that stability hasn't been achieved yet. A global recession is not underway, but the risks are rising. In a nutshell, global recovery continues, but it is still quite fragile, and I think this cartoon explains the issue quite clearly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you actually laid the ground very well. I have an immediate follow-up question, if I may, which is, there is a feeling that some structural factors are at play here. I mean, so if you look at it from a cyclical perspective, it is quite clear that we are in an unusual recovery. Now, I always found a little bit difficult as an economist to distinguish cyclical and structural factors, but the feeling is that they both are at play in this moment. And in particular also with regards to oil price. What is your view on that? What are, according to your analysis, the structural factor which might be at play, which justify the type of environment we are in?
Now, let me try to answer this question, thinking about first what explains the slowdown we have seen in emerging market economies especially, And then thinking about the oil markets a little bit. In the context of emerging markets, the slowdown we have seen since 2010 has both cyclical as well as structural drivers. On the cyclical side, of course, we see a significant slowdown in advanced economies. External demand is weak, trade remains weak. You can also say the commodity prices being weak, and a number of emerging market economies are major commodity producers, having an impact on them. Now, another important issue, of course, on the structural side, these cyclical factors there, on the structural side, is the weakness in productivity. And that productivity weakness is not just in the context of advanced economies. Emerging market economies has been a hindrance in front of growth. Of course, in many countries, unfortunately, especially major emerging markets, there has been a hesitancy in terms of understanding, in terms of implementing structural reform policies. And in many cases, there has been a period of political uncertainty, and associated with that, of course, the softer confidence and softer investment growth. All in all, you have both cyclical and structural reasons driving the growth dynamics. In the case of oil markets, of course, the big change is the technological force and the role of shale production, or the unconventional sources of oil coming to the market and playing a major role since 2006, when the oil prices, in a sense, started reaching a peak. Now, one thing we know, even if oil prices increase to $60, $70, and I think it's going to be very difficult to see those numbers in an environment of kind of prolonged fashion, there will be other sources coming to the market, especially from shale, and providing oil. And that structural change, in a sense, is going to cap the oil price, probably around the levels that are equal to the cost of, the marginal cost of shale oil producers. But let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's actually something very important to keep in mind. So, of course, the fallout of the drop in commodity price in 2015 has been stronger in those economies which are very dependent on oil exports. And this could not be more true than the Middle East and Central Asia, where, as we know, oil plays a fundamental role. So it is actually a pleasure to have Masood Ahmed, who is the Director of Middle East and Central Asian Department at the International Monetary Fund, who I believe will give us an overview about how the region is coping with these trends. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think where Ayhan ended is a good place for me to start, because if you look at the big changes in the world economy, clearly the fall in oil prices is the one factor that has had the biggest impact on this region. And when I say this region, let's focus for a moment on the Caucasus and Central Asia. I'll say a word about the Middle East as well. But the other factor that has also had an impact here is the slowdown in the major partners. Russia, directly affected by oil prices, but by other factors as well. And the slowdown in Russia, the contraction in Russia, the rebalancing in China, and the drop in oil prices are three shocks that are working on these economies. What's the consequence of that? The consequence is that the Caucasus and Central Asia this year has the lowest growth rate in 20 years, 1.2%. It's lower than it's been in the last 2 decades. Oil exporters affected for the reasons that I mentioned. But interestingly enough, the oil importers in this region, whom you would expect would benefit from lower oil prices, have had the impact of lower oil prices transmitted onto them in a negative way through their links with the oil exporters. So Tajikistan, Kyrgyz Republic, Caucasus, in the Caucasus, Georgia and Armenia. Those economies, although they import oil, they are so dependent in terms of remittances, trade, and investment. Their links with Russia, their links with Kazakhstan are so great that they too have been negatively impacted. Some of you probably know this number, but I'm always struck by the fact that in Tajikistan, remittances account for 40% of GDP. They've gone down by a third this year. When they go down by a third, that overwhelms any positive effect from lower oil prices. So this region has been negatively impacted by the oil price and by the indirect effects of the oil price. Now you take the Middle East, just for a moment, if I could give you the sense for the Middle East. So the Middle Eastern oil exporters, many of them even more dependent on oil for their economies. To give you one number, 2015, the income from oil for the oil exporters in the Middle East went down by roughly $400 billion compared to the previous year. That's almost a fifth of their GDP. Now, income for oil goes down. What is the consequence of that? And now I move a little bit into the policy response that the countries have done to deal with it. The first reaction in the first half of 2015 of oil exporters in the Middle East and in Central Asia and the Caucasus was to say, this is probably going to pass. So they've all saved up over the last decade some financial resources when oil prices were rising, and they all decided in varying degrees, this is the time to use the financial resources we have saved up. So instead of cutting back spending, in the first half of 2015, the first reaction was to continue to spend, but to finance it from the savings that they had rather than from the oil income that was coming in. By the middle of 2015, I think the consensus begins to settle that this is not a short, sharp, V-shaped drop in oil prices. This is the new reality. We don't know where oil prices are going to settle exactly, when they're going to settle at that level. But we do know that it's, for structural reasons that Ayhan described, it would be very imprudent for any policymaker to assume that oil prices are going to go back above $50, $60 in the medium term. That's the number that most people are working to. That how quickly they get there, hard to say, but planning on anything over $50, $60 as your baseline becomes a little bit too risky for any policymaker. Now, if you accept that, then they begin to realize that most of these countries were actually spending from their budgets at levels that could only be financed if oil prices were substantially higher than $50. So they had to bring their spending down in many countries. And you see that in the second half of last year. You see that in the budgets for this year. Almost every country is beginning to cut back a bit on spending. Some countries who have the resources have said, even as we cut back on certain kinds of spending, particularly energy subsidies, particularly some current spending, we need to reorient our spending and perhaps invest a bit more in other areas that will begin to change the structure of the economy. So in the near term, there are two challenges that are being faced by countries in this region. First, how do you manage the cutback in your spending in a way that brings you to a sustainable equilibrium in the medium term and it can be in the medium term because most of the countries have the resources to be able to take their time. How do you bring it to a sustainable equilibrium and at the same time, without being so quick in your cutback that it begins to have a further drag on the economies which are already slowing? So balancing that trade-off. Different countries are going to come at different places. The countries that have the most resources can afford to take their time. They can afford to be slower about the adjustment. Some that have less have to do so more quickly. But you see in countries all the way, whether you're talking about Saudi Arabia or Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, they're all basically saying we have to cut back our spending quite substantially. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge they're facing, in this region particularly, is that almost every country in this region decided that in response to lower oil prices and in response to what happened to the ruble and to the dollar, they had to, either out of choice or out of necessity, also depreciate their own currencies. So all the exchange rate adjustments that have taken place in this region have meant, that has made the adjustment process a bit easier because the exchange rate was one of the tools that they used to affect the adjustment. But it has consequences. And what are the consequences? Well, immediate consequences, managing simply the spillovers from the actual adjustment to a lower rate on the financial sector. Many of the banks will see some increase in NPLs as a result of that. They see also some problems in terms of that heavy degree of dollarization limits their ability to move on that. Looking at the impact on inflation, and as many of them are also using this opportunity not just to adjust the rate, but to move to a more flexible exchange rate system, some degree of targeting inflation rather than nominal exchange rate. That also means putting in place the mechanisms to manage a different approach to monetary policy. So the short-term challenges are monetary policy, exchange rate management, and fiscal trade-off. But the big long-term challenge that they face is, if this is the new reality, that oil is going to be $50 rather than $120, then how do you reorient your economy to become less dependent on oil? Everybody is talking about diversification today. But diversification means different things to different people. So as you begin to change the nature of your economy to become less dependent on oil, less dependent on the state, less dependent on a relationship between the citizen and the state, where the state provides jobs for everyone and provides them with cheap energy and provides them with subsidies and transfers, to one where the economy is more diversified, the private sector plays a bigger role, and individuals who have up to now mostly been receiving from the state start contributing in terms of taxation or in other ways. That's a major economic, social transformation that will take a decade to bring about. But that is the medium-term challenge, I think, facing all of these economies in different dimensions. And what is quite interesting now, you've seen in Saudi Arabia recently, there's a vision that has come out for Saudi Arabia 2030 to transform that economy, make the private sector much larger, make the economy much less dependent on oil. If you get into it, you realize that actually bringing these changes about requires looking at the business environment and making quite substantial and fundamental changes to the way in which the private sector is regulated, to the role of the state, and to the nature and composition of public spending. So these are big transformational changes that we're looking at over the next decade in these economies as they adjust to the new reality. And I think the real tension as we move forward will be to make sure that while you deal with the short-term imperatives of managing the fiscal adjustment and dealing with the exchange rate and monetary policy issues, you also keep in sight the agenda for economic transformation if you want to achieve a diversified economy that is actually going to be much more resilient than the ones that historically have been dependent on oil. And I'll end with giving you one number, which is this region has been growing for the last 15 years at a very healthy rate, high sevens. If you look at the projections for the next 5 years, in the country projections that we have, when you aggregate them up, you see that for the next 5-7 years, the projected growth rate is less than half of the last decade. Now, some of that is just the fact that we're going through a transition, but to really get from the 3.5% growth rate for the medium term to one that is higher, that actually generates improved living standards and jobs for the young people that are coming into the labor force in these countries, you're going to have to go through the economic transformation that I mentioned, because you can no longer ride the back of commodity prices to deliver the growth rates that you've seen over the past decade. Let me stop with that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's, I think we are coming back on the topic of diversification in a minute, because of course that's fundamentally the challenge faced by most of these countries. Maybe one follow-up question on what you mentioned, and I like the phasing of the response that you mentioned. But one thing which I always notice is that if you compare your regional remit include the Middle East and Central Asia, one important difference between the Middle East, in particular the GCC region, and Central Asia, and I would include also Russia in this big group in terms of oil exporting economy, is the currency, the exchange rate. The GCC is pegged to the dollar, so in some way they were not able to use the exchange rate as a sort of a policy tool to alleviate the impact. Instead, we saw Russia doing that, Kazakhstan moving to a flexible exchange rate in the course of 2015. What do you think are the implications? And if I can be a little bit even more provocative, do they have a certain advantage here in Central Asia thanks to the fact that they have a flexible exchange rate compared to the Gulf, where they are forced either to use accumulated wealth or to fiscal restructuring?
I think that's a very good question. So if you look at the consequences of going the two routes, Central Asia, Russia decided to use the exchange rate as one of the adjustment tools. And obviously that gives you one extra tool. You can make your adjustment through that, but you have to manage some of the consequences, in particular impact on inflation, looking at whether or not you can control wage increases in the second round, looking at also the financial sector implications that I mentioned. So you have to be able to manage those, but it gives you that tool. GCC countries have had a peg and decided that they want to stay with the peg, because in the middle of all this transition with everything else changing, you need a degree of stability and an anchor to serve them well, and our view is that it continues to serve them well. But the consequence of that is that the adjustment that they have to make, the fiscal adjustment they have to make, has to be made exclusively through direct fiscal measures. They can't use the exchange rate to bring about a reduction in aggregate demand. And to do that, therefore, to sustain the credibility of their exchange rate policy in the medium term, the focus will be on whether they are able to implement the kind of fiscal adjustment, the cutbacks in spending that are required over the medium term to bring their demand and supply in balance. So I think it puts more of a spotlight on the fiscal measures themselves, and that's why, to me, the fact that they have taken very important cutback decisions in 2016 is very good, because it sends a signal of intent. But what people will be looking at is to also see a medium-term fiscal and macroeconomic adjustment plan, because that's what gives credibility to the policy stance that you've adopted.
Very much. So this brings us directly to the political response, and it is a pleasure actually to have Minister Sultanov from the Republic of Kazakhstan, who I'm sure will tell us how Kazakhstan is dealing with this new reality. The floor is yours, Minister.
Thank you very much, Massimiliano. I will speak Russian, so please use your headphones. Я в первую очередь хотел бы также поблагодарить организаторов за возможность участвовать в сегодняшних дискуссиях, в целом на этом форуме. Это очень важная для меня площадка. Я уже 9-й раз участвую на этом форуме. И без лишнего хвастовства, но с гордостью хочу отметить, что я был у истоков формирования этой площадки. И я очень рад сегодня видеть моего старого друга Марка, который с первых дней этого форума поддерживает, участвует активно и формирует очень важное мнение. Мы 10 лет уже, почти 10 лет, обсуждаем очень важные вопросы, но, к сожалению, пока эта площадка, возможно, еще до конца не услышана, и поэтому, наверное, много проблем сохраняется. Но в целом, если говорить о текущем десятилетии, особенно в последних годах, то они наглядно демонстрируют, что проблемы мировой экономики не уменьшают, а нарастают и даже усиливают друг друга. Слабый и неустойчивый экономический рост в сочетании с шоками на рынках сырьевых товаров существенно повышает риски для глобального развития. Замедление происходит повсеместно. Наиболее пострадали, естественно, как уже здесь отмечалось, развивающиеся страны, в первую очередь экспортеры сырья, и Казахстан не исключение. Современные тенденции в мире сигнализируют о том, что все больше неопределенности в выборе действенных экономических стратегий и тактик. И сегодня вот в презентации Ayhana здесь можно подспудно увидеть о том, что очень часто тонкая грань и очень трудные переходы между мифами, надеждами и реальностями. И постоянно разгораются, естественно, споры между приверженцами монетарных и фискальных мер. Сегодня вот мы как раз говорим о них. И очень часто эти споры выливаются в сторону, к сожалению, побеждающих популистских и ультранационалистических настроений, что грозит, естественно, разжиганием социальных недовольств во всех экономиках, как развивающихся, так и развитых. И это мы сегодня видим наглядно. Одни эксперты утверждают, что восстановить экономический рост только монетарными политиками или мерами не получится. И действительно, политика низких процентных ставок и покупки центральными банками многих стран оказалась малоэффективной в оживлении крупнейших экономик. В попытке преодоления последствий затяжной рецессии монетарные институты ряда стран начали прибегать к нетрадиционным даже мерам, это отрицательным ставкам. Однако очевидно, что такая стоимость денег в течение длительного времени вызовет нестабильность финансовых систем во всем мире, изначально основанных на концепции положительной доходности. С другой стороны, доходности финансовых инструментов сегодня перестают отражать связанные с ними риски, и как следствие оценки рисков дефолтов все усложняется. Отсутствие доходности как государственных инструментов, так и корпоративных заставляет сегодня институциональных инвесторов, пенсионные фонды, страховые фонды менять стратегию управления активами и вынуждая их вкладываться в более длинные и рисковые и неликвидные инструменты. По расчетам агентства Fitch, облигации с негативной процентной ставкой стоимостью около 10 триллионов долларов США будут стоить пенсионным фондам и страховым компаниям порядка 24 миллиардов долларов ежегодно, и ставя под угрозу будущие выплаты пенсионерам и страхователям. Вы понимаете, что будущие дефициты пенсионных систем – это бомба замедленного действия. Изменится же, конечно, и поведение вкладчиков, корпораций, инвесторов, так как такие ставки являются ничем иным, как налогом на сбережения или на наличность. Поэтому, естественно, вкладчики будут реагировать уходом из банков, соответственно, банки будут стараться сохранить доходность, что в сегодняшних условиях также ударит и по ним, по их прибыльности, и по эрозии капитала. Поэтому и инвесторы, и вкладчики, и сами банки будут искать или направлять свой капитал в тихие гавани. А затем гонка начнется снова по кругу, то есть война за капитал пойдет снова по кругу. В контексте глобализации, поэтому отрицательные такие ставки, они могут существенно изменить механизмы функционирования денежных и валютных рынков, положив начало новым валютным войнам. В этих обстоятельствах часто звучат призывы в поиске решения и стимулирующей фискальной и бюджетной политики, нежели мягкой монетарной. Действительно, есть примеры, когда сокращение государственных расходов, в том числе не только вот у нас, господин Масуд сегодня очень наглядно говорил пример нашего региона, но и в развитых странах, и в еврозоне мы это видим, что вот такие резкие сокращения расходов вкупе с отсутствием структурных реформ приводят, к примеру, в сфере труда или пенсионное обеспечение, приводит к дефициту совокупного спроса и высокому уровню безработицы. В то же время это бьет по реальной экономике, кредитование реального сектора становится очень рискованным, и в свою очередь финансовый сектор, банки перестают выдавать кредиты. Но есть и твердое мнение, что смягчение ограничений налоговой бюджетной политики может привести в последующем к макроэкономическим дисбалансам в условиях разворота мировой финансовой системы, опять к дорогим деньгам, и это приведет к столкновению дефолтных отношений. Вместе с тем есть понимание завершения суперцикла роста цен на сырье и ожидания изменений на мировых рынках, где энергоносители, металлы, продовольствие постепенно будут дешеветь, экспортеры энергоносителей обеднеют, а их импортеры высвободят определенные ресурсы на собственное развитие. Итогом окончания суперцикла станет значительное сокращение трансферта богатств от стран-импортеров сырья в страны-экспортеры. И как следствие мы опять увидим тектонические изменения в соотношениях мирового спроса, предложения и предложения, производства и потребления в цепочках добавленной стоимостей. Все это опять-таки говорит о том, что мировое сообщество не только не вылечилось от болезней прошлого десятилетия, приведших к самому масштабному и мутирующему кризису, но и продолжает усугублять его новыми проблемами. Мы уже стали привыкать, видим каждый день в средствах массовой информации, мировых средствах, что всемирный или глобальный диалог вместо совместного поиска антидотов все больше превращается в отрывки каких-то геополитических споров и даже бряцания оружием, и на фоне которых, естественно, будет процветать терроризм, экстремизм и даже эпидемии. Поэтому налицо, что пора искать какой-то действенный механизм, и одной из главных задач все-таки должно стать искоренение застарелых перекосов в мировой финансовой и экономической архитектуре, которая нам еще досталась с прошлого тысячелетия. Об этом очень часто говорил и говорит наш глава государства, президент Назарбаев. Он не раз это обсуждался на этой площадке и в своих статьях. Мы здесь тоже подробно разбирали с Марком такие статьи, как «Ключи от кризиса», «Пятый путь» и так далее. И я еще раз хотел бы поблагодарить, что есть возможность эти идеи дальше развивать. Если говорить применительно к Казахстану, здесь тоже вот Масуд очень наглядно показал схожие проблемы нашего региона. И говоря конкретно о Казахстане, мы действительно оказались в сложной ситуации, когда наша доходная часть, наши флагманы нашей экономики очень сильно привязаны к ценам и спросу на мировых рынках. И, к сожалению, отсутствие в предыдущие годы действенных мер по диверсификации экономики. Этому способствовали в том числе и высокие цены. Как наш премьер-министр вчера на встрече с МВФ назвал это «Nirvana Time». Это тоже повлияло на то, что мы не смогли принять действенных мер. И всего два крупных центра притяжения для бизнеса и для предпринимательской активности в экономике. С одной стороны, это бюджет, с другой стороны, нефтегазовый горнорудный сектор, который в случае падения цен автоматически проседают автоматически доходы бюджета и проседает, естественно, вся экономика. Мы столкнулись с этой проблемой. Одновременно у нас с предыдущего кризиса пришли проблемы в финансовом секторе. Сегодня тоже об этом говорилось. Высокий уровень долларизации, низкий уровень доверия к финансовой системе. И, соответственно, у нас одновременно происходит снижение, не смягчение монетарной политики, а наоборот ужесточение. И одновременно мы пришли к необходимости сокращения фискальных возможностей. И, соответственно, единственным подспорьем или возможностью здесь оказались наши резервы. То есть в те тучные годы нам удалось в условиях высоких цен накопить свои резервы до 70 миллиардов долларов в нашем национальном нефтяном фонде. И мы дважды использовали. В первый раз мы это использовали в кризисе 2008-2009 года, когда нам пришлось экстренно спасать нами же раздутые сектора. Это финансовый строительный сектор, который надули пузыри, взаимно помогая друг другу. И в этом уже более структурном кризисе нам пришлось еще раз использовать резервы. И если мы в 2009 году плавно приземлились до 1% роста экономики, то в этом году мы тоже в первом квартале уже видим существенное некоторое снижение показателя. Но за счет того, что мы своевременно принимали антикризисные меры, включили программу Нурлужол, это новая инфраструктурная программа, которая плавно вписывается и в такие программы наших соседей, как экономический пояс шелкового пути. Она решает две задачи. Сегодня мы также обеспечиваем не снижение рабочих мест, поддержку развития экономики, и, соответственно, это условие для следующего этапа развития. И здесь свойством казахстанских программ, антикризисных программ является то, что мы одновременно и тактические задачи решаем по смягчению влияния кризисных явлений, и одновременно решаем стратегические задачи по следующему росту. Поэтому не случайно в 2009 году мы запустили программу индустриализации, а в прошлом году главой государства была инициирована программа глубоких институциональных реформ, которые мы стараемся воспользоваться вот таким периодом низких цен, воспользоваться и обеспечить все-таки структурные реформы, которые в будущем создадут условия для диверсификации экономики, потому что другого пути нет. Можно долго спорить о каких-то тактических мерах, о монетарных, фискальных мерах, но другого выбора у нас, как структурной реформы, нет. Мы сегодня увидим и на другой площадке, это Совет по экономической политике при президенте Российской Федерации Путине. Я думаю, мы будем тоже с интересом наблюдать как раз столкновение двух этих направлений. И есть там также третье мнение, что России сегодня тоже требуется структурная реформа. То есть все мы в регионе понимаем, что без этого у нас другого шанса пережить следующие кризисы нет. Спасибо.
Thank you very much, Minister. Maybe a follow-up question would be, as you deal with a new reality, you search for new drivers of growth. And I would say that in this part of the world, the Euro-Asian Economic Union, the new Silk Road, the infrastructural investment plans that we all read in the international press, and everybody's impressed about the magnitude of this investment. Can you maybe a little bit elaborate more about how do you see this helping and providing this one of the additional pillars of growth for Kazakhstan and for the overall region?
Конечно, вот какой-то переноса каких-то подходов, оно и не может быть. Мы вот сегодня тоже с МВФ и с Всемирным банком очень подробно говорили и видим примеры. И когда сравниваем с тем же Ближним Востоком или даже Казахстан с Россией, у нас очень много различий. И, конечно, здесь нужна композиция различных мер. И поскольку факторов тоже очень много. Факторы, которые двигали развитие наших стран в предыдущие годы, это большой приток ресурсов от экспорта и одновременно хороший объем инвестиций за счет того, что большое доверие экономической политике, в целом развитию, возможностям и тем же запасам в Казахстане. Да. И сегодня мы, когда наблюдаем резкое остановку вот этих вот факторов, их можно замещать только продолжением повышения доверия по инвестициям. Поэтому мы видим, что инвестиции – это сегодня основной источник для развития Казахстана. И если те факторы, как развитие собственной финансовой системы, фискальные возможности, они ограничены, то вот я опять-таки повторюсь, может быть, благодаря вот нашим запасам и структурным реформам мы будем делать упор на инвестиции.
Thank you very much. Before I open to the floor, I mean, I was asked to be a speaker, then I was moving to moderating role. So let me also have the opportunity of, given the fact that we also have enough time, to touch upon the issue that I was supposed to talk about it, which has been touched in different occasions during the speech that I heard so far, which is basically the use of sovereign wealth, as I call it, in order to navigate and deal with this new reality. And let me put this also into the context of what also this means in how this institution, in particular sovereign wealth funds and central banks, I would say, will operate in the future. I am actually in the process of presenting this paper in a few weeks' time to our conference that we organize every year in Switzerland, where UBS is headquartered. And the title that I have is Sovereign Wealth Declining: The End of an Era. And actually, I don't feel, sometimes bankers like to use big titles, but actually I believe that this is probably the end of an era, because if you put these dynamics into a historical context, and I mean of the last, let's say, 15 years, the change that we are witnessing is actually dramatic. In the sense that if you consider what I call a sovereign wealth, is fundamentally the sum of two things, which is the assets managed by central banks in terms of reserves, and the assets managed by so-called sovereign wealth funds. I tend to pull them together because to a large extent, in terms of what are their source, are broadly the same. What is different is just the institution which is in charge of managing it. And if you look at the last 10 or 15 years, actually the growth in sovereign wealth has been staggering. I mean, just to give you some numbers very quickly, in 2004, the total sum of foreign exchange reserve and sovereign wealth funds asset was about $5.7 trillion, of which about $4.3 trillion were reserves and $1.4 trillion were assets managed by sovereign wealth funds. In 2010, this amount already grew to $13 trillion. And in 2014, which has been the peak, it actually reached $17.2 trillion. So we're talking about a yearly growth rate of 10%. And believe me, any institution receiving assets of the 10% every year, it makes you feel good because you have plenty of resource to be used in the way that you think it is most appropriate. Then we moved to 2015. And in 2015, actually, we witnessed the first drop in nominal terms over the last 15 years. And with my team, we spent a lot of time in trying to estimate the magnitude of the drop. because as you know, these numbers are not always public, or it is very difficult to identify exactly the magnitude, but we came out with an estimate of a drop of around 1.2 trillion globally. Of this 1.2 trillion globally, it is very interesting to see where the drop came from, because actually it is not only about commodity price. In fact, if you split it between oil export, commodity exporting economies and non-commodity exporting economies, the first part, the commodity block, lost about half a trillion of assets. And these are basically accounted for foreign exchange reserve used, for instance, by Saudi Arabia, by Russia, some of them used in Kazakhstan. But half a trillion doesn't sound actually so big in the context of the amount. The other $500 billion largely comes out of China and a few other emerging markets, which in some way have been dealing with a problem which is different from oil. In the case of China was the turmoil in the exchange rate and the intervention in the RMB market, but very much interlinked to the oil price, because as you know, oil price came down probably largely as a result also of the slowdown in the emerging market economies. Now, if you look at this, so this is what I call the end of an era. If I look at the future, we also did a lot of estimate about the potential rise in sovereign wealth funds from now on. And the number we came up for the next 5 years, including the return that you can generate on the accumulated wealth, which when we are talking about trillions, return can become a very important source of income, it is about 5.5%. So in terms of growth, we're moving from an environment where sovereign wealth and assets managed by this institution were growing at 2-digit, we're moving in an environment where they are growing at single-digit. And if I look at different countries, you might well see a situation where sovereign wealth will continue declining. Probably a good example is Russia, which publicly say very openly that they're going to use the fiscal buffers as much as they can to stabilize the economy in terms of fiscal expenditure. Now, what does this mean for a country, for countries relying on this? And I think here we have, it's always nice because when these big growth trends stop, you see who did the very good homework and who didn't. And actually there are a very large group of countries, and I would include Kazakhstan into this group, which have been very wise to accumulate during the booming years. And now they're taking advantage of that move. There are other countries who actually did not. And there are several examples out there without naming them because it sounds that I'm giving the votes. But those countries which have not accumulated enough will find themselves to suffer much more pain in terms of fiscal restraint. So let me touch on a point which also has been mentioned by our colleague from the IMF. If you look at the way these sovereign wealth funds were created to deal exactly with this type of situation, you accumulate, you of course invest for the future generation, but you also accumulate a fiscal buffer which is used during time like this. And this is exactly what you would expect. If you look at, for instance, at a country like Saudi Arabia, I think it was very interesting, the remarks made by the previous speaker about the timing. In 2015, how did Saudi Arabia dealt with the problem of oil price? I did a little bit of estimation. Fundamentally, when you are a country dealing with a fiscal shock, like the drop in oil revenues, you have 3 ways to deal with the problem. Either you use the accumulated wealth, either you reduce your expenditure and you try to improve the fiscal balance, or you issue debt. And of course, you can use these 3 policies as a mix. And actually, Saudi Arabia, if you look at 2015, it did an adjustment in the area of around a little bit in excess of $100 billion. Of these $100 billion, more than $70 billion have been reserved, drawn down from the fiscal buffer. Another $19 billion have been spending cuts, which I would say, so we're talking about 20% of the adjustment through fiscal cuts, and about $26 billion have been issuing of debt. In the case of Saudi Arabia, was mainly placed with the local banking sector. So the first things you do, you use your accumulated wealth, you eventually ask for help to your domestic financial sector, and eventually you try to reduce expenditure. Now we are seeing the second phase, and I think it was mentioned very clearly from the IMF gentleman. We are going to see more fiscal restructuring, we're going to see more fiscal expenditure cuts, and eventually we're going to see a new mix of fiscal policy, which will mean, and I believe we're going to see the use of debt as well, maybe by tapping an international debt market rather than the local one. So this is the picture that we are seeing at the moment, and you could take this mix and look at how each country has been used in this mix. And we know that Kazakhstan has been issuing as well in the international debt market and is going through the fiscal restructuring that was just mentioned by the minister. I would like to conclude this by making two final remarks, because I mean, the importance of sovereign wealth is not only the way this wealth is being used by the sponsoring country to deal with their own fiscal issues. Actually, sovereign wealth has become so large in terms of assets that what sovereign wealth funds and central banks do have the potential to have implications for the global economy as a whole. And one of these implications, which is a slide that I have in front of me, is that I call it the end of the saving glut. I mean, this is a term which sometimes sounds a little bit bad, which basically said that over the last 15 years, we've been used to see this massive flow of funds from either China and over Asian emerging market or from over oil commodity exporting markets into the global economy. According to many, this huge amount of wealth has had implication for global capital markets. Major two implications. The first one is that long-term interest rates have been lower than what they would have been without this additional flow of money coming into the market. And the second implication, which is probably less talked, but very much talked in my world of asset management, is that these sovereign wealth funds have become a major entity in what we call sometimes so-called direct investments. You see China sovereign wealth funds buying assets in the US, in Europe. We saw this flow of money growing very fast. So this, from a global perspective, this end of an era in the sovereign wealth fund, sovereign wealth growth raises two important questions. First of all, what will be the implication of having this lower flow of saving into the global economy? Will long-term interest rate be higher? If I look at the last few quarters, I would say no. But probably there are other factors at play which compensate for that. Eventually, when quantitative easing and negative yields will eventually go away, maybe we will see the materialization of that effect. The second question is if we are going to see less activism in inverted comma among the sovereign institutions in terms of buying Western assets. I don't have an answer yet. What I can say as an observer and as someone who works very closely with this institution around the world, that we have not seen yet a pullback from this type of investment. And the reason is that in this part of the world, in China, in emerging market, there is a tremendous desire for internationalization, for diversification of their industrial base. And the use of sovereign wealth funds as a mean to reach out and buying assets from manufacturing company, and etc. And the case of China is probably the most important one. It remains very strong. Final point, most of this money can also be used not only for fiscal restructuring. The new Silk Road Fund, the new Asian Infrastructure Bank launched by China, all these initiatives by and large are financed through the accumulated wealth of which sovereign wealth funds assets are one of the components. What we are also seeing is that as these countries start to deal with the new reality, they are also starting to use their accumulated wealth not only for fiscal stabilization, which is absolutely needed, but also for continuing into this internationalization strategy, which is at the pillar of countries like China, and I would say also like Kazakhstan. I stop with my remarks, and I believe that it is the right time to open to the floor for our follow-up question, unless there are comments from my speakers.
If you permit me, I'd like to make just one point I think that you raised. It's an important point people are focusing on right now, which is that if you look at the choice facing each country, I think as you said very rightly, in 2015, on average, in the Middle East, the countries used a quarter of the adjustment was done through cutback and spending, 3/4 was done through either using their resources or borrowing, so one of the combination. Going forward, that number will change, but a significant part of the adjustment over the next 5 years is going to be some combination of asset drawdown and borrowing. When you look at borrowing, there are two options. You can borrow domestically, which means either you run down your deposits domestically in the banking system or you actually borrow from the banking system, or you borrow internationally. And both of those raise different issues for countries to consider. If you borrow domestically, you have to be careful of the consequences of this for the liquidity in the banking system, because the banks in many of these countries have been used to living off deposits coming from the government. Suddenly, the deposits from the government are going down. The government's actually trying to borrow from the banks. And the net result is that their readiness and ability to provide money to the private sector is getting lower. And you see some tightening of liquidity now in some countries. So it is an important concern. If you borrow internationally, you don't have that problem. But for international borrowing, you will need to provide markets with a clearer, more transparent, medium-term macro and fiscal adjustment plan to be able to get the kinds of rates that you would like. All of the large oil exporters can borrow a little bit in the international market at very good rates. But when you start borrowing year after year, then people will start asking you, what is your adjustment plan? And I think some countries that have an adjustment plan for the medium term will find it easier to go to the markets than those that are going from year to year without a clear medium-term strategy. So I wanted to kind of add that point because I think these choices about how you finance your fiscal deficit are going to have important consequences in terms of managing your asset and debt management strategy.
Unless there are additional comments I would open to the floor. I think there are microphones floating around so that we can take questions. If you have any, please raise your hands and the microphone will reach you. We have one on the back, I can see there.
Good morning, I'm Mattia Romani with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Good morning. I had a question about reforms, which featured in some of your interventions. I was wondering, could you tell us, do you think this slowdown is an opportunity for deeper reforms, or is it a challenge to reforms? Thank you.
Who wants to take it? Shall we take another? There are more questions, or? Minister.
У меня есть ответ. Я думаю, что замедление – это хороший шанс для реформ. Потому что я уже говорил о том, что есть такое понятие нирвана тайм, или наши соседи говорят тучные годы. Конечно, в такие годы никогда не хочется смещаться, уходить от устоявшихся каких-то решений. И опять-таки Казахстан этому яркое свидетельство. Я уже говорил, что мы в 2009 году, когда мы столкнулись с кризисом, в который мы вошли там буквой V, и тогда это уже был второй такой кризис, который нас достаточно глобально зацепил, и мы вынесли урок, что с предыдущего десятилетия мы не так диверсифицировали свою экономику, и надо ускоряться. И поэтому мы запустили программу форсированной индустриализации, но тем не менее, когда цена была очень высокой, нефтегазовый сектор все равно превалировал в развитии экономики, и другие сектора не двигались. Я уже говорил, что мы четко понимаем, и это понимают сейчас многие страны, что нет выбора против структурных реформ. Нужно менять фундаменты, нужно менять в целом парадигмы и модели развития. И вот как раз низкие цены, снижение, несмотря на то, что инструментарий, как уже было сказано, может меняться, может усложняться, фискальные ограничения есть монетарные трудности, как бы, да, но в композициях в любом случае мы должны достигать таких изменений.
Masood, maybe from the, I know that the IMF is a big advocate of structural reforms, and what is your view? Yeah. What is, from your point of observation, maybe you can give an overview of what is the state of reform across the region?
Look, I think reforms are never easy. And they're particularly not easy in societies where the social contract is based on a particular relationship of individuals, companies, and the state. So it's never easy. But we know that when prices were high, we don't have a good track record of reform in that period. So this is an opportunity. The only point, I very much agree with what the minister said, the only point I want to add is that the one lesson we have drawn is that today you cannot do reform without persuading people of why you want to do it and communicating clearly what is your objective, why the changes that you're going about are needed, and how to engage them in that process. I think the days, if they ever existed, when you could reform economies and do major structural reforms without a communication and engagement strategy for the population, are over now. So that is why I think one of the skill sets that is in our region, probably something we have to work on, is to develop the capacity, willingness, mindset, and techniques for engaging the population in the project of reform. And that's why personally I'm very positive about the Saudi vision that has been laid out, because some people say it may not be fully realized, and maybe it won't, but the fact that you're laying out for the population in Saudi Arabia, particularly for the young people, a vision of what that country and society and economy will look like beyond oil, has a huge galvanizing effect in terms of mobilizing a consensus for reform. So I think communication is going to be much more important in the future.
Thank you. So I think we all know the saying, you never want to waste a good crisis. So in the case of reforms, crises present, I think, the greatest opportunity, given what the minister as well as Masood mentioned. Undertaking reforms is always a challenge. When the crisis comes, there is no other option. Now, in that context, I'm going to make just 3 points. The first one is that not all reforms are equal. There are certain reforms you undertake, really, that have significant adverse implications in the short term. You can go undertake a labor market reform that can generate quite a bit of reallocation within the labor market and have adverse impacts for certain segments of the society. In most cases, the most vulnerable ones, the World Bank cares about. So during crisis periods, given the output contracts, the challenges mounting, undertaking those types of labor reforms can generate more aggravation. So it's important to be mindful when we undertake labor reforms and think a reform program that is compassionate, not just well communicated, as Masood mentioned, very important issue, but having this compassion element is critical. Now the second point is that for policymakers especially, as I mentioned, these structural reforms, most people think that they have only long-term benefits. And in most cases, short-term, they create problems for the policymakers. In fact, in an environment like the one we have, countries need to find ways to differentiate themselves. How they can differentiate themselves? They can simply show that it's not just the short term they are worried about. They are worried about medium term and the long term growth. And the only way to do that is to undertake reforms and send a strong signal. That signal, of course, has to come with a medium term program. Masood explained it very nicely, with clear legs on the fiscal policy, monetary policy, as well as a plan to push the productivity frontier and bring the country to that frontier as soon as possible. And the third important point is that the reforms can have limitations. We need to acknowledge that as well. And we cannot basically think that we are going to pass some laws and things are going to change tomorrow. You can pass laws, you can implement, certain legislation and see that the product markets are going to improve, labor markets improve. You can hope that. But ultimately, the issue is not passing the legislation. The issue is implementing that legislation and making sure that that legislation has some biting effects. And when we look around the world, we see that a number of governments on paper are undertaking reforms, but in reality, when it comes to implementation, they are failing. And that's a challenge we have to be mindful of. So on one hand, we want to be compassionate when we undertake these reforms. On the other hand, when we pass the legislation, we would like to be aggressive as we can be, to make sure the fruits of reforms are there for all of us.
Thank you. Let me once again open to the floor if there are questions. Oh, sorry.
Я вот как раз хотел тоже согласиться с высказываниями Масуда и Айхана о том, что очень важно в реформах, они действительно, какие бы они реформы ни были, они всегда очень сложные. И очень важно здесь иметь, с одной стороны, приверженность, чтобы не было противления изменениям, с другой стороны, всегда надо иметь оценку всевозможных результатов и соответствующий набор инструментариев и решений. И всегда нужно смотреть с точки зрения эффекта Кобры. Вот один из немецких экономистов, Хорст Зибер, такую теорию эффект Кобры приводил, простой пример, когда английские колонизаторы в Индии привлекли население, платя им за каждую голову кобры, чтобы не было смертности среди колонизаторов, да? И за год превратилась смертность в 0, но еще через год смертность удесятерилась. Только из-за той же приверженности местного населения к этим изменениям. А оказалось, то, что платили за каждую голову кобры, привело к тому, что индусы выращивали этих кобр прямо под носом у тех же англичан. Поэтому всегда нужно оценивать, к чему это приведет. И простой пример таких изменений, реформ, это вот последние споры у нас в Казахстане по земельным вопросам, когда налицо необходимость использования земли как наилучшего актива, и мы, страна 9-я по размерам в мире, находясь в подбрюшье у такого рынка, как Россия, имея прямой выход на поднимающий уровень жизни очень быстро Китай и Индию и другие страны региона, могли бы стать такими поставщиками продовольствия, что является как раз одной из главных проблем тысячелетия. Но для этого необходимо землю превратить в реально действующие активы. Но неправильная подача информации или несвоевременная подача информации приводит к тому, что идет непонимание конечной цели, и неправильный выбор инструментов, конечно же, будет всегда иметь проблемы. Поэтому вот такие мы примеры уже имеем, и все свои реформы, конечно же, будем стараться оценивать с точки зрения набора инструментов и конечного результата.
Есть вопрос. Добрый всем день. Нуржан Алимухамбетов, страховой сектор. Я тоже являюсь участником, уже не первый год прихожу на форум, и с первых его проведении все время как бы мы отмечали, да, кризис есть, с ним нужно бороться, уже накоплен определенный опыт, и все время говорится о том, что вот посмотрите такой опыт, посмотрите такой опыт, мы сталкиваемся с такими вызовами и с такими вызовами. Хотелось бы уже услышать, что заканчивается всегда выступление на том, что нам нужно изменяться, нам нужно структурно меняться. Можете ли вы сказать, какие структурные системные изменения конкретно уже могли бы быть рекомендованы для того, чтобы преодолевать кризис?
Thank you for this question, which I hear quite often when I talk to the board members of the World Bank. Now, this is like, you know, you go to your primary care physician every year and ask, you know, your medical report. And your primary care physician pretty much tells you the same thing. You need to, you know, eat healthy, you need to exercise, you need to pay attention to your sleep, you need to have a balance between, you know, work life and your social life. At least my primary care physician tells me the same thing every single year. Whether I implement those or not, I don't know. The next year I hear the same thing. So in the case of the global economy, of course, we all need to remember that during the 2008-9 crisis, the global economy came very close to a cardiac arrest. And the legacy of that cardiac arrest is still with us. Of course, the global financial crisis was also a result of excesses the global economy accumulated over time. Call them unhealthy practices, the accumulation of very large amount of debt, the asset bubbles around the world, credit bubbles, and now deflation of bubbles, but still the legacy of that and the challenges that basically bring to us. Now, there is still demand deficiency around the world. There is still a problem of weak productivity growth and low potential growth. All of these will require an extended period of vigilance and aggressive policies. Those policies we see in major central banks implementing to the degree never seen in history. When you look at the Central Bank of Japan, you see that. European Central Bank, you see that. The US Federal Reserve implemented early during the crisis. In the case of fiscal policy, early on in the crisis, there was aggressive implementation of the policy, even though that changed after 2010. With respect to structural policies, in some parts of Europe, there have been significant progress. But unfortunately, in many emerging and frontier market economies, is still a significant structural reform gap. And we need to undertake those structural reforms. When it comes to fiscal policy, whatever we have done prior to the crisis, we used that space. Now that space has eroded. We need to generate that space that will require undertaking consolidation measures. In the context of monetary policy, I think the policymakers are doing their best to generate the growth and inflation they are hoping for. Now, at the end of the day, things haven't improved in the way we expected. That's why we downgraded our growth forecast almost every year since 2010. We are hoping that things will improve, but it's like, you know, the global economy requires constant maintenance. And that maintenance comes with the fiscal policy, that maintenance comes with monetary policy, at that maintenance come structural reforms. And this is no different than you are going to your primary care physician and he is sending you, or she's sending you a letter. The IMF and the World Bank providing policy recommendations, and those recommendations are somewhat similar to the letters you get from your primary care physician. Ultimately, as individuals, we do certain things well, and we are unable to do certain other things that well. Countries are similar to that, and it's not easy to implement policies. Ultimately, it's not that easy to have a very healthy lifestyle. So let me stop there.
Medical advice, and I think we have another really few minutes left. If there is a last question, we take it. If not, I think, well, I don't see any questions. So let me start. Let me go back to the starting point, which has been falling oil price. We move from that to what does it mean for the global economy, for the regional economies. Then we touch upon how these economies are dealing with this change in the energy markets. What are the fiscal implications? What are also the monetary implications, in particular on the exchange rate policy? But I think it would be fair to say that the major conclusion is that, and I sense this for both our two international institution representatives, but also from the minister, who in the end is the one who has to implement those medical advice, that the need for structural reform and for moving ahead with diversification cannot be stronger than now, and probably this is now the time to act on these levers to put once back this economy on a sustainable growth path. So let me thank you, our panelists, and I think it was a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, there is going to be coffee in the restaurant on the first floor to the left. Уважаемые дамы и господа, сейчас будет кофе-брейк в ресторане на первом этаже.